The road to Barrio San Laguno was barely more than a dirt path, swallowed by creeping vines and gnarled trees that seemed to lean in closer with every mile. Althea gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening as the family's old pickup truck rattled over another pothole. Beside her, Mike stared silently out the window, his face unreadable. In the back seat, 7-year-old Lucas hummed to himself, oblivious to the tension thickening the air. They hadn't planned on coming here. Not like this. Not ever, really. But life had a way of forcing people into corners. And when the letter arrived stamped with the official seal of the Barangay Council, Althea had known there was no choice. The paper had been crisp, the ink dark and deliberate, as the sole surviving blood relative. You are hereby notified of your inheritance of the estate of the late Kapitan Elena V, including all lands and properties therein. Kapitan Elena. The name alone made Althea's stomach twist. Her great-aunt had been a legend in San Laguno, though what kind of legend depended on who you asked. To the politicians in town, she was a formidable leader, a woman who had brought roads and electricity to the barrio when no one else cared. To the farmers and fishermen, however, she was something else, a woman who spoke in riddles, who held midnight meetings in the woods, whose shadow never quite matched her movements, and now she was dead. The official report said heart failure. The villagers whispered otherwise. The truck lurched to a stop at the edge of the property. Before them loomed Casa Montemayor, a relic of Spanish-era grandeur, now crumbling under decades of neglect. Its once white walls were stained with mildew, the wooden balconies sagging like broken bones. The windows, dark and hollow, seemed to watch them. "Home sweet home," Mike muttered, but there was no humor in his voice. Lucas, however, was already scrambling out of the truck, his small feet kicking up dust as he ran toward the iron gates. "Mama, look, there's a lady up there." Althea's breath caught. She followed his pointing finger to the second-floor balcony, where the curtains fluttered in the wind. Empty. Of course it was empty. Just the wind. "Anak," she said, forcing a smile. But the back of her neck prickled. The keys the lawyer had given them were heavy, rusted with age. The front door groaned as Mike pushed it open, releasing a gust of damp, stale air that carried the faint scent of something sweet and rotting camphor and cinnamon, Althea thought, though she couldn't place why that unsettled her. Inside, the house was a museum of forgotten things. Dust-coated furniture sat exactly where it had been decades ago, as if waiting for its owner to return. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes tracking the family's every move. In the parlor, a grand piano stood with its keys exposed, yellowed like old teeth. Then Althea saw it. On the wall above the fireplace, a portrait of Kapitan Elena dominated the room. She was younger in the painting, her sharp features frozen in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And clutched in her hands was a small, leather-bound book, the same one now sitting on the mantelpiece below the portrait. Althea reached for it, her fingers trembling. The moment she touched the cover, a whisper slithered through the air, "Come to Cinnamon Kaz." Naparaba Bauji. She spun around. No one was there. Mike was upstairs, his footsteps heavy on the creaking wood. Lucas was outside, laughing at some imaginary game. But the voice had been real, and it had come from inside the walls. That night, as the family settled into their unfamiliar beds, the house began to breathe. The floorboards sighed beneath their weight. The wind carried murmurs through the cracks, words in a language that shouldn't exist. And in the darkness, just before sleep took her. Althea could have sworn she felt fingers cold and skeletal brush against her ankle from beneath the bed. The inheritance had been accepted. Now the real terms of the bargain would begin. The oppressive silence of the house was worse than any noise could have been. Althea lay rigid beneath the thin blanket, staring at the water stains on the ceiling that twisted into shapes like screaming faces in the moonlight. Next to her, Mike snored softly, undisturbed by the unnatural heaviness in the air. She wanted to wake him, to voice the dread coiling in her stomach. But the rational part of her, the part that still clung to the world of daylight and logic, whispered that she was being foolish. Old houses settle. Strange noises are normal. Then the scratching began. At first, it was faint as skittering, insect-like sound coming from somewhere beneath the bed. Althea held her breath, straining to hear. The moment stretched, silent again, and she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Then, louder this time, scritch, scritch, scratch, like something with too many legs dragging itself across the wood. "Mike," she hissed, jabbing his shoulder. He grunted, rolling onto his side. "Wah, listen, do you hear that?" The scratching stopped. Mike exhaled through his nose, half asleep. "It's just rats. Thea, old house. We'll set traps tomorrow." He was already drifting off again, when Lucas's voice cut through the dark like a knife. "Mama?" Althea bolted upright. Lucas stood in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted by the weak moonlight filtering through the hall window. His voice was wrong to flat, to calm. "Anak, what's wrong? Did you have a bad dream?" He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one small hand and pointed down the hall toward the bathroom. "The lady in the mirror is crying." A chill seized Althea's spine. Mike, now fully awake, swung his legs out of bed. "Kids sleepwalking," he muttered, but his voice was tight. They followed Lucas to the bathroom. The door was ajar. The mirror fogged over, as if someone had just taken a steaming shower, except the air was icy, their breath visible in white puffs. Mike reached out to wipe the glass, but Althea grabbed his wrist. Words were etched into the condensation. "I lock you, hunggang duolang. I locking pins, and go indinatea ospa." The letters dripped like tears. Mike swore under his breath, swiping his hand across the mirror to erase the words, but they didn't smudge. They remained, deepening, carving themselves into the glass with a sound like cracking ice. Lucas tilted his head, his eyes glazed, and repeated, "She's crying." Then, from the hallway behind them, a wet, ragged sob. Althea whirled around. The hall was empty, but the sound came again, closer this time, choked and broken, as if whatever was making it had forgotten how to breathe. Mike shoved past her, flipping on every light switch he passed, but the bulbs flickered weakly, some refusing to turn on at all. "Lucas, come here," Althea whispered, pulling her son against her. His skin was freezing. The crying stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, the bathroom faucet turned on by itself. Water gushing rust-brown into the sink. Mike lunged to shut it off, but the handle wouldn't budge. The pipes groaned, the walls shuddering, as the water pressure surged. Then, with a final, metallic shriek, the faucet spat out a clump of black hair, tangled with something white and jagged. "We're leaving now." They didn't bother packing. Althea carried Lucas to the truck, his body limp in her arms, his eyes fixed blankly on the house. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as they sped down the darkened road. None of them spoke. It wasn't until they reached the empty highway, the house long swallowed by the night behind them, that Lucas finally stirred. He blinked up at Althea, his voice his own again. "Mama, why is the lady sitting in the back seat?" Althea's blood turned to ice. In the rearview mirror, reflected for just a fraction of a second before vanishing, was the gaunt, waterlogged face of a woman, her mouth sewn shut. The roadside motel's flickering neon sign cast jagged shadows across the ceiling, the hum of its faulty wiring, the only sound in the cramped room. Althea sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, watching Lucas's chest rise and fall in the dim light. He'd fallen asleep almost immediately after they'd arrived, his small body exhausted from whatever had gripped him back at the house. Mike paced near the door, running a hand through his disheveled hair for what must have been the 100th time since they defled. "We should call someone," he muttered, voice low so as not to wake Lucas. "A priest. I don't know, someone who deals with this kind of thing." Althea didn't answer. Her fingers absently traced the raised edges of the strange words still lingering in her mind. "Lock you. Hungang dualong, ng. The syllables felt thick and unnatural, like something not meant for human tongues. A sudden knock at the door made them both jump. Mike moved first, peering through the peephole before relaxing slightly. "It's just the night manager. Probably about the payment." He opened the door to reveal a gaunt old man holding a clipboard, his watery eyes darting past Mike to where Althea sat. "Folks, sorry to disturb," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "Just need to confirm you're the ones who came from the Monte Mayor place, ain't ya?" The air in the room grew heavier. Mike's shoulders tensed. "How'd you know that?" The old man's lips stretched into a smile that showed too many teeth. "Small town. Word gets around." He leaned in, the scent of mothballs and something faintly rancid wafting off him. "You oughta know she don't like it when folks leave. Specially not family." Before Mike could respond, the man shoved something into his hands, a small cloth doll with button eyes and stitches, forming a crude smile. "So the boy keeps the bad things away. Sometimes." The door slammed shut before Mike could refuse it. Althea stared at the doll in Mike's hands, her skin crawling. There was something wrong with its proportions, the arms too long, the head lolling at an unnatural angle. "Throw it away," she whispered. Mike hesitated, then tossed it into the trash bin by the TV. The moment it hit the bottom, Lucas sat bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You made her angry," he said, voice flat and hollow. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost spiderwebbed across the mirror above the dresser, forming the same jagged symbols they'd seen in the house. The faucet in the bathroom turned on with a screech, water running black and thick as oil. And then the shadows moved. At first it was Satala darkness pooling in the corner that shouldn't have been there, stretching longer than the dim lighting could account for. Then it took shape, tall, emaciated, the outline of a woman with two long limbs, her head tilted at an impossible angle. Mike grabbed Lucas, backing toward the door. Althea fumbled for the keys, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice. The shadow figure took a jerking step forward, then another, its movements all wrong, like a puppet with broken strings. The overhead light burst with a pop, plunging them into darkness, save for the erratic neon glow from the sign outside. In the flashes of red light, the figure appeared closer each time, now at the foot of the bed, now by the TV, now right beside Althea, the smell of damp earth and rotting flowers filling her nostrils. Lucas began to scream. Not the frightened cry of a child, but a guttural, wrenching sound that shook the walls. And beneath it, another voice hissing, wet, speaking in that same impossible language. Anda pobrium. Mayala upa. The Galimp pain. And Lolo, at Lola. Mike finally got the door open, shoving Althea and Lucas through first. They didn't stop running until they reached the truck, the motel room door slamming shut behind them with enough force to rattle the windows in their frames. As Mike sped out of the parking lot, Althea dared to glance back. The old night manager stood beneath the flickering sign, waving goodbye. And in the window of the room they'd just fled, the shadow figure pressed its hands against the glass, watching them leave. The truck's headlights cut through the pride-on fog as they sped down the winding mountain road, the engine whining in protest. Lucas had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep in the back seat, his small fingers still clutching Althea's sleeve like he was afraid she might disappear. Mike's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle twitching. Neither of them had spoken since fleeing the motel. What could they possibly say? Althea stared out at the passing trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The first hints of sunrise painted the horizon in sickly yellows and purples, but the light brought no comfort. Something cold and heavy had settled in her chest the moment they'd left Casa Montemayor, a weight that grew heavier with each passing hour. "We need answers," Mike said suddenly, his voice rough. Althea nodded, watching the way his eyes kept darting to the rear-view mirror, not checking on Lucas, searching for something else. Something that might be following. The road dipped sharply, revealing the first scattered houses of Barrio San Laguno proper. It was a place frozen in time, weather-beaten wooden homes with rusted tin roofs, stray dogs nosing through garbage in the ditches, an ancient stone church with its cross tilted precariously to one side. The few people already out at this hour stopped to stare as the truck rumbled past, their expressions unreadable. Mike pulled up outside a dilapidated sari-sari store, its faded Pepsi sign buzzing weakly. "Wait here," he said, though the way his gaze lingered on Lucas made it clear he was unsure that was the right choice either. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. Through the grimy window, Althea watched him approach the old woman behind the counter. Lola is, if the whispers at the funeral had been correct, the village's oldest resident, and the only one who might know the truth about Capitana Elena. Lola Isco's reaction was immediate. She crossed herself, her lips moving rapidly in what might have been a prayer. When Mike spoke, her wrinkled face paled, and she hurried around the counter to pull the store's curtains shut. A hand touched Althea's shoulder. She nearly screamed before realizing it was Lucas, awake now and staring past her at the store. "Mama," he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "The bad lady's friends are here." Outside, the stray dogs had begun to whine, pressing their bellies to the ground. The few villagers on the street were retreating into their homes, doors clicking shut one by one. A unnatural silence settled over the barrio, broken only by the distant sound of a child's laughter. Except there were no children in sight. The store door burst open. Mike stumbled out, his face ached. In his hands was a yellowed photograph. Capitan Elena standing with a group of villagers in front of Casa Mont. Except the villagers' faces had been scratched out, and behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the house's windows, were shapes. Too many limbs. Eyes where eyes shouldn't be. Lola Isco appeared in the doorway, her voice carrying across the suddenly still street. "You should not have come back," she called, her words slurred by missing teeth. "The land is hungry. It has tasted your bloodline once already." Before Althea could respond, Lucas let out a small, broken sound. She turned to find him holding something in his lap, the doll from the motel, its button eyes gleaming despite never having been taken from the trash. Its stitches had begun to unravel, revealing a glimpse of something dark and wet inside. And from the direction of Casa Montemayor, barely audible over the suddenly howling wind, came the sound of something laughing. The doll's stuffing spilled onto Lucas' lap like clotted blood, thick and glistening in the pale morning light. Althea's stomach lurched as she recognized the texture. It wasn't cotton or polyester, but strands of matted hair clumped together with something sticky and dark. Lucas made a small, distressed noise in the back of his throat, his fingers trembling as he tried to push the vile thing away. But it clung to him like it had been sewn to his skin. Mike threw open the truck door with enough force to make the hinges scream. "Give it to me," he demanded, his voice cracking with barely restrained panic. When he grabbed the doll, the remaining stitches burst apart with a sound like tearing flesh, revealing the horror inside. A human finger, blackened with age, but unmistakable. The nail still intact and painted with chipped red polish. Lola Isco's wail cut through the unnatural silence that had fallen over the village. She stumbled toward them, her arthritic hands clutching at her chest, as if trying to keep her heart from bursting free. "You've touched it now," she moaned, her milky eyes wide with terror. "The bond is stronger. She knows you carry her mark." Althea's breath came in short. Panicked gasps as she frantically wiped Lucas' hands with the hem of her shirt, but the black residue wouldn't come off. It seeped into his pores like ink, forming twisting patterns that vaguely resembled the same symbols they'd seen in the house. The more she scrubbed, the more the marks seemed to spread, crawling up his arms like living vines. "We need to leave," Mike said, through gritted teeth, throwing the desecrated doll into the dirt, where it landed with a wet thud. "Now. Before whatever the hell is happening." A sharp crack cut him off. The doll's head split open down the middle, and a swarm of black beetles poured forth, their carapaces gleaming like oil in the sunlight. But worse than the insects was the sound that came with them. A woman's voice, distorted and wet, whispering from 1,000 tiny mandibles at once. "And I come to Makbubokaya. Let tell you." The village erupted into chaos. Doors slammed. Shutters rattled closed. Even the stray dogs howled and fled, their tails between their legs. Lola Isco grabbed Mike's arm with surprising strength, her nails drawing blood. "There is only one way," she hissed. "You must return. You must finish what she started. The house must be fed, or it will come for us all." Althea wanted to scream, to deny, to pack her family in the truck and drive until they hit the ocean. But then Lucas spoke, his voice no longer his own. Deeper, older, laced with something ancient and cruel. "Hangin Palai. Indeed, you Perry. Makalimata and Panya." The words hung in the air like a curse. Lola Isco recoiled as if struck, crossing herself repeatedly. "It's already in him," she whispered. "If you don't return, it will eat him from the inside out. Piece by piece. Like it did to the others." As if to emphasize her point, Lucas suddenly convulsed, his back arching unnaturally as a thick, black substance bubbled from his lips. Althea screamed, catching him as he collapsed forward, his small body racked with tremors. The ooze dripped onto her arms, burning like acid but leaving no marks, just an impossible cold that seeped straight to the bone. Mike's resolve shattered. He turned the key in the ignition with shaking hands, his face a mask of grim determination. "We're going back," he said, his voice hollow. "But we're ending this. One way or another." As the truck roared to life, Althea caught a glimpse of movement in the rear-view mirror, dozens of pale faces peering from the windows of the abandoned homes. Their features stretched too wide, their eyes black and unblinking, watching, waiting, and beneath the tires. The discarded doll's hand twitched, its rotting finger pointing, accusingly, toward Casa Montemayor. The road back to Casa Montemayor stretched before them like a rotten vein, the jungle pressing in from both sides with a suffocating intensity. Lucas lay across the back seat, his breathing shallow, his skin waxy and pale, except for the inky tendrils now creeping up his neck. Every bump in the road made him whimper a small, broken sound that tore at Althea's heart. She kept one hand on his feverish forehead, the other clutching the yellowed photograph Mike had gotten from Lola Isk's Kapitan. Elena stood rigid and proud before the house. But the shadows around her feet didn't match the angle of the sun. They stretched too long, too thin, ending in grasping fingers that curled around the ankles of the faceless villagers. Mike's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. "When we get there," he said, his voice low and rough, "we need to find whatever she used to." Lucas sat up so fast, his head cracked against the window. His eyes flew open, completely black, pupil and iris swallowed by darkness. His mouth stretched into a grin too wide for his face, lips splitting at the corners as he spoke in a voice that was UNT's. "Hug, I mean in that, he will like a who. He need you long as see him a tanga pumpa kata, not mo." The truck swerved violently as Mike jerked the wheel. Althea screamed, grabbing for Lucas as his body began to convulse, his limbs thrashing with unnatural strength. The photograph fell to the floor, and in the chaos, she saw something she hadn't noticed before: the faint outline of a symbol scratched into the corner. The same twisting marks, now spreading across Lucas's skin. Then the smell hit Kapari and sweet, the stench of old blood and spoiled meat. The air in the cab grew thick, pressing against Althea's eardrums like diving deep under water. Lucas's convulsions stopped abruptly. He went perfectly still, his head tilting at an impossible angle as his black eyes fixed on her. "Mama," he said, his voice suddenly his own again, small and terrified. "A bad lady says. We're almost home." The truck's engine died. Not sputtered, not stalled, died instantly, as if something had reached into the machinery and snuffed it out. They rolled to a stop directly before Casa Montemayor's rusted gates, which now stood wide open despite Mike having chained them shut when they fled. The house loomed before them, its windows glowing with a faint, pulsing light, not the warm yellow of lamps, but the sickly green of rotting things, phosphorescing in the dark. Mike turned the key frantically, but the engine didn't even click. The headlights flickered once, then died, plunging them into near. Outside, the jungle had gone eerily silent. No insects, no birds, just the creak of the house's old timbers settling. Not from one direction, but from everywhere at once: the trees, the dirt, the very air itself. Dozens of voices overlapping, some human, some anything but, all repeating the same phrase. The influence of the media. I think it's because of the influence of the media. Lucas giggled. High, manic sound that didn't belong to a child. His fingers dug into Althea's arm, nails breaking skin as he leaned close, his breath reeking of grave dirt. She wants to show you where she keeps the others, he whispered. Under the floor. In the walls. They're so lonely, Mama. Mike threw open his door, dragging Lucas out with him. The boy didn't fight, his body limp as a marionette with cut strings. When his feet touched the ground, the earth itself seemed to shitter a deep, groaning vibration that sent cracks spider webbing through the driveway's concrete. From the house's open front door, something moved. Not the shadow figure from before, but something worse, a pale, bloated shape crawling on all fours, its limbs too long, its head lolling bonelessly as it dragged itself across the porch. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, the voices rising to a shriek as the thing raised its head, and Althea saw, with a horror that turned her bones to ice, that it had Lucas's face. Mike stumbled back, clutching their real son to his chest. The thing on the porch cocked its head, its mouth splitting open to reveal row upon row of needle-like teeth. Going to be a little bit late, it rasped in Mike's voice. I'm going to be a little. Then the house's front door slammed open with enough force to shake the foundations, and the real nightmare began. The moment the door slammed open, the thing wearing Lucas's face scuttled backward into the house like a cockroach fleeing light. Althea's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled from the truck, her legs numb with terror. Mike clutched the real Lucas against his chest, the boy's head lolling unnaturally over his arm. His eyes still that horrible, endless, black. The whispering voices rose to a crescendo around them, the words indistinct now, but the malice behind them clear as broken glass. The house beckoned, Althea knew, with a certainty that made her stomach twist, that they had no choice. Whatever curse clung to this place had already sunk its claws into Lucas, and if they wanted any chance of saving him, they would have to follow. The thought of stepping back inside made her skin crawl. But the alternative, living her son to whatever lurked within, was unthinkable. The interior was worse than she remembered. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something sweetly rotten, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting slightly with a sound like rustling paper. And the shadows, dear God, the shadows moved on their own, twitching at the edges of her vision like living things. Mike made for the stairs, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the unnatural silence. We need to find that book, he muttered. The one in the painting. If there's answers anywhere. A floorboard creaked behind them. Althea turned just in time to see the doll, the same one they'd left at the motel. The same one they'd watched disgorge beetles in the village, sitting primly on the hallway table. Its button eyes gleamed with malicious intelligence, and its stitches had reformed into that terrible, knowing smile. As she watched, its head turned with a soft, fleshy sound to track their movement. Lucas stirred in Mike's arms, his voice emerging as a dry rasp. In no pitoniana denalia ucam caret sasalimo geneamo. Castellanan well, at. The words slithered through the air like snakes. And for a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. Then the portrait of Capitan Elena crashed to the floor, the glass shattering outward as if pushed from behind. The leather-bound book tumbled free, its pages fluttering open to reveal handwriting that shifted and squirmed before Althea's eyes. One moment, elegant Spanish. The next, that same jagged, impossible script from the mirrors. Mike snatched it up, his hands shaking as he flipped through pages that seemed to bleed at the edges. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. Althea peered over his shoulder, her stomach turning at what she saw. Not a diary, it's a ledger. Names, dates, descriptions of offerings given to the house. And sketches. God, the sketches of things with too many limbs and mouths in places mouths shouldn't be. The entries grew increasingly frantic as they went on. Kapitan Elena's handwriting, deteriorating into barely legible scrawls. The hunger grows. First the livestock, then the servants, now even the travelers passing through. It's never enough. The walls are always watching. Last night I saw him in the mirror, the one who calls himself Hungung. He says my time is coming, that the house will have its due. The final entry was written in what looked like dried blood, the letters shaky and desperate. They're in the walls now. I can hear them scratching. My son first, then me, then whoever comes next. It's the only way to keep it sleeping. The only way to... The sentence ended abruptly. A wet, tearing sound came from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable noise of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Lucas's head snapped up, his black eyes fixed on the ceiling, as his lips peeled back in a grin that showed every tooth. "She wants to show you the basement," he whispered. "Where the bad children go." From the darkness at the top of the stairs, a single, pale hand emerged, skeletal fingers curling in invitation. And the doll on the table began to laugh. The basement door stood slightly ajar, its hinges weeping rust like old bloodstains. Althea's pulse hammered in her throat as she stared at that sliver of darkness, her mind screaming at her to run while some deeper, more primal instinct rooted her to the spot. The air smelled different, here, thick with the coppery tang of fresh blood, undercut by something earthy, like freshly turned grave soil. Mike had Lucas slung over his shoulder now, the boy's limbs dangling bonelessly, his head bobbing with each step in a way that made Althea's stomach lurch. "He's waiting," Lucas murmured, his voice no longer his own but something older, something that slithered out from between his teeth like a living thing. His black eyes fixed on the door, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Steve smiled, a grotesque stretching of lips that split at the corners, beads of dark blood welling up in the cracks. The doll's laughter followed them down the hall, growing louder instead of fading, as if it were right behind them, despite Althea having left it shattered on the floor upstairs. Mike's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling so badly he missed twice before finally gripping the tarnished brass. The moment the door swung open, the temperature plummeted. Althea's exhale fogged in the air as she took in the narrow staircase, descending into blackness. The wooden steps warped and bowed as if something massive had dragged itself up them repeatedly. Walls glistened with moisture, the shadows moving unnaturally, twitching like restless fingers. Mike took the first step, the wood groaning ominously under his weight. "We get down there, we find whatever's left of Kapitana Elena's ritual. And we end this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The house seemed to pulse around them, the very air vibrating with something like anticipation. Halfway down, the whispers started. Not from one direction, but from everywhere at once, the walls, the floorboards, a darkness itself, chorus of voices, both young and ancient, murmuring in overlapping tongues. Althea caught fragments of Spanish, Tagalog, and that same guttural language from the mirrors. "Hanggang dualong," eye-locking pins and go indina ta. A spa. ... Double quotes. Then the crying began. Not the theatrical sobs of horror movies, but the genuine, heart-wrenching whimpers of terrified children. The sound seemed to come from just ahead in the darkness. Always, just out of reach, pulling them deeper into the basement's belly. Althea's skin prickled, every hair standing on end as her foot hit the final step. And something brushed against her ankle. She barely stifled a scream as she looked down. The concrete floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, but it wasn't empty. Dozens of small handprints marred the surface, some fresh and sticky, others old and faded. All leading toward the center of the room, where a massive circular stain darkened the concrete like an old blood spill. Mike set Lucas down gently near the wall, the boy's body folding into itself like a broken marionette. His head lolled to the side, his black eyes fixed on the ceiling as his lips moved soundlessly, forming words that made Althea's ears ache just from watching. Then the lights flickered. Not electric lights, there were none down here, but a sickly green phosphorescence that seeped up from the floor itself, illuminating the basement in pulsing waves. In that ghastly glow, Althea saw the walls were covered in markings, some carved into the stone, others written in what looked like dried blood. The same symbols from the book, from Lucas's skin. From the mirrors, all converging on that dark stain in the center of the room. And standing in the middle of it was Capitan Elena, not the proud woman from the portraits, but a hunched, withered thing with skin like parchment and eyes that glowed the same unnatural green as the light. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, just a rush of cold air that carried the stench of decay. Behind her, the shadows thickened, forming into shapes too terrible to comprehend: long limbs, too many joints, mouths where eyes should be. "You shouldn't have left, Capitan." Elena's voice echoed, not from her body, but from the house itself, the walls vibrating with each word. "The house is hungry. It's been so long since it's fed." Lucas sat up suddenly, his back arching at an impossible angle as his jaw unhinged. The same black ooze from before pouring out in a thick stream. It hit the floor with a wet slap, slithering toward the bloodstain like a living thing. And from the darkness above them, the doll's laughter turned to screams. The black ooze reached the bloodstain, and the house shuddered a deep, groaning vibration that sent cracks racing up the walls like spikes. Althea stumbled back as the concrete beneath her feet grew warm, then hot, the scent of burning hair and rotting meat filling the basement. "Capitan." Elena's corpse-like form began to convulse, her jaw unhinging wider than humanly possible as a torrent of beetles poured from her mouth, their shiny black bodies forming writhing patterns on the floor. Mike grabbed Althea's arm, dragging her toward Lucas, but the boy was no longer there. Where he'd been sitting, the shadows had coalesced into a pulsing, humanoid shape, elongated limbs, too many joints. Its head a featureless oval, except for a mouth stretched into a grin too wide for any human face. "You broke the cycle," it hissed, its voice the sound of 100 children whispering in unison. No more waiting. No more hiding in walls. The thing that had been Capitan Elena collapsed inward like a deflating balloon, her desiccated skin crumbling to dust as the beetles swarmed over her remains. The house groaned again, the walls bleeding black ichor that sizzled where it touched the floor. Althea's ears popped as the air pressure changed violently, the whispers rising to a deafening shriek. Then silence. Absolute, perfect silence. The green light faded. The ooze stopped moving. Even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. Lucas lay on the floor where the shadow creature had been. His chest rising and falling normally, his eyes closed, as if in peaceful sleep. The marks on his skin were gone. Mike reached for him, his hands shaking, but froze when his fingers passed through Lucas's arm like mist. "Althea," Mike's voice cracked with terror. She turned and screamed. Her own body lay sprawled near the bloodstain, eyes wide and unseeing, mouth slack. The flesh of her arms was mottled with bruises in the shape of handprints, both child-sized and adult. Mike scrambled toward her corpse, but his hands passed through it just as they had through Lucas. The realization hit like a physical blow. They were dead. The house had taken its due, after all. Then the laughter started. Not from the darkness, but from inside Althea's own cold, feminine chuckle that vibrated through her bones. The basement walls peeled away like rotting skin, revealing endless corridors lined with doors that stretched into infinity. Behind some, children sobbed. Behind others, things scratched and gibbered in the dark. And standing at the center of it all was Althea, but not as she'd been. Her reflection in the pooling black ooze showed a woman with too pale skin, lips stitched shut with black thread. The house's whispers now came from her mouth, the voices of all its victims tangled together in an endless chorus. Mike's ghost reached for her, his expression shattered. "Althea." "No." She smiled or tried to. The stitches pulled painfully, drawing blood. "Maraming salamat po sa pagsuporta," she heard herself say. The words echoing through the infinite halls of Casa Montemay. Outside, the first villagers were already gathering at the gates, drawn by some unnameable instinct. They would find Lucas alive on the front steps, clutching a doll with button eyes. They would whisper that the new Kapitana looked so much like the old. And in the basement, the bloodstain pulsed, once hungry, but patient. It knew the cycle would begin again.